Okay, Chapter 3 is titled The Biogeography of Island Life, Biodiversity Hotspots in Context. This is a mouthful, but you can boil everything down in Chapter 3 to a discussion of biodiversity and why islands are so diverse, why the diversity on islands is so important, and what hotspots are. So that's what we're going to dig into here in Chapter 3. Here you can see a somewhat older 2009 dated article that discusses biological diversity and compares island biodiversity to mainland biodiversity. And as you can see from the title, islands are incredibly diverse, and the concentration of biodiversity on islands is much, much higher than it is on mainland areas. That's not to say that there are more species in total on islands, but when you take into account their size and the uniqueness of the creatures on those islands, they are by far more complex, unique, and interesting systems than mainland regions. Here we have a map illustrating biodiversity hotspots as delimited by Conservation International. And if you read box 3.1, starting on page 47, I say if, when you read this, I know you already read it, you'll be quite surprised, I'm sure, to learn that these hotspots are areas that contain such a remarkable concentration of biodiversity. And they're not only biodiverse, but they're also threatened. So the idea in delimiting these hotspots is that they should have at least 1,500 species of plants that are found only in that area. So they've got a rich plant fauna that's diverse and endemic, so found only there. And these areas have also lost at least 70% or more of their vegetation cover, meaning the forests have been cut down, destroyed, developed, whatever. So this is a really concerning combination of lots of unique things that are there and lots of destruction and deforestation. So this map, you'll note, has 11 areas that are exclusively islands. Actually, I think it's 10, I'm sorry. 10 of these areas are exclusively islands, and the interesting aspect of this is that these hotspots, so including the ones that are on continents, mainland continents, they cover only 2.3% of the Earth's surface, but they have more than 50% of the world's plant species found only in these regions, and 42% of terrestrial vertebrates. So these areas contain lots of diversity, and it's found only in these areas. The reason why in, say, Southeast Asia, you can see that these different island groups are not all one big hotspot is because biogeographically, as we will learn, they're very, very unique. And in particular, I want you to pay attention to the two between Australia and Southeast Asia, so Sundaland and Wallacea. So as you look closely, you'll see that those two are very close to one another, and it looks like they almost, in fact, touch, which they don't. But that's going to be an interesting aspect that we addressed in a subsequent slide. So islands are super diverse. They're highly imperiled, endangered, disturbed, lots of habitat destruction, and we're going to keep going as we consider biodiversity of islands. Okay. So, species poverty is the surprising title of section 3.2 in this chapter. And what this means to point out to you is that, while I've just been telling you that islands are really diverse, that they have lots of unique things, they don't have more species than mainlands. And that's primarily due to a limitation of size. Now, here in this graph, islands are represented by the open squares. And so if you look at the x-axis is size, so the bigger the island is, so moving from left to right, the more species there are of plants, so going from bottom to top. So as islands get larger, or as you visit larger and larger islands, you'll see more and more species. Now those closed circles and open circles represent two different regions on the mainland in the United States. These are quite diverse areas themselves, so San Francisco is one of them, and Marin County, so coastal California, pretty diverse area. But if you take small subsets of the San Francisco area, so these black dots, okay? If you look at those dots, if you only examine how many species of plant are in a certain area, let's say 2 square kilometers, 2 log, so it's on the log scale on the x-axis, but that leftmost solid black circle, it has more species of plant than an island of similar size. So it's higher on the y-axis than any of those open squares. What that's telling us is that even though these islands are quite diverse, a similar sized area on the mainland probably has more species. The difference is when you compare 2 of those open squares that are at that same size, they have very different species, okay? 2 different islands are going to have very different species, and lots of them. When you compare 2 of those solid filled black circles that are all in the San Francisco area, they have lots of species, but those 2 black circles have probably almost the exact same species. So it's that widespread nature of the species found on mainlands, that lack of uniqueness within the same area, that makes islands so interesting and unique. Section 3.3 touches on a couple things that we're going to dig into, and the first is disharmony. This term is used quite frequently to describe island fauna or island communities. So if you visit an island like St. Lawrence Island, so this is the relatively large orange island here between Alaska and Russia. Okay, so if you see that island, it's kind of, I have no idea what that's shaped like, but it's the large orange island there. Okay, St. Lawrence Island between Alaska and Russia, kind of out in the middle of the ocean. Now I want you to think about what species you would expect to be on that island. If we look at the land mammals of Alaska, look at all of these different species. There are bears, there are muskox, bison, reindeer, lynx, coyotes, all sorts of things. Do you expect all of these species to have an equal probability and chance of colonizing that island out in the ocean? Do you think a muskox is as likely as a beaver to make it out to that island? Okay. This is disharmony. The fact that some of these species are more likely to get to that island and colonize it and inhabit the island than other species are, that leads to there being an unusually disproportionate representation on the island. So for example, on the island, we might expect there to be lots of those small rodent-looking creatures, but very few of those larger hoofed creatures, like the muskox, the moose, the caribou, the bison, the sheep. Okay? Those things are unlikely to swim out into the ocean. Okay? But a beaver, an otter, a weasel, a squirrel, a marmot, those things can swim or float or raft out to the island more easily. Okay? Also, think about the size of islands. An island of a particular size is more likely to be able to support a population of plant-eating creatures like, let's say, a ground squirrel. Okay? It can probably support a large population of ground squirrels. It may not be large enough to support a population of muskox or moose because it's simply too small to provide enough food for enough individuals to survive and breed and maintain a sizable population. So for this reason, we see that only a subset of the continental organisms end up making it to islands and establishing themselves on islands. And the reason certain species don't occur on islands could be A, they're incapable of reaching the island, and or B, they can get there, but but the island does not have the resources they need to support a large breeding population. Now, some of what I just told you about applies to the term that's being used here as a filter. So the dispersal capability of an organism and the habitat on the island are filtering mechanisms, okay, that lead to the disharmony. So if you look here, what I've got illustrated on the top are, on the left, a patch of habitat that's characteristic of the Galapagos Islands. So they have low shrubby growth. It's generally quite dry because they're way out in the ocean, swept by wind, and receive relatively little rain. To the right, you can see a characteristic image of a rainforest in coastal Ecuador, which is directly east of the Galapagos. So the map is at the bottom of this slide. So think about the organisms in Ecuador that might colonize the Galapagos Islands. Remember, the Galapagos are oceanic islands. They've never touched the continent. The only way things can get there is to fly, swim, or float. Okay? So, what organisms are going to fly, swim, float out to these islands? It's unlikely that a jaguar is going to swim or float out to these islands. What's more likely is that something small like a lizard, a snake, or a turtle can survive the long journey. Those reptiles generally are good at surviving these long journeys because they don't necessarily need to eat all that often. So turtles, snakes, they can go weeks without eating. So there are certain organisms that are going to float. They're going to survive that long distance, long time journey, whereas others are not. Now, you might think it quite remarkable that an organism could float such a distance, but this has happened in the past, and we've seen instances of organisms like snakes swimming miles from shore, elephants swimming miles and miles away from shore. And in 2004, an Aldabra tortoise, pictured here, which occurs only on the island of Aldabra, an atoll, so you remember those circular-shaped islands that are the result of coral growth around sunken volcanoes. That's the island of Aldabra. There's an endemic species of tortoise there. In Kimbiji, off the coast of Tanzania, one of these tortoises was found floating almost to the beach, covered in barnacles. This tortoise had been floating for at least 7 weeks in the ocean, long enough to be encrusted with barnacles and washed up on the beach in Tanzania. Okay? This is an enormously long journey that is obviously survivable by species like this. Okay? This is why we have Galapagos tortoises. There are tortoises on the mainland of South America in Ecuador that were able to survive being washed out to sea, floated to the Galapagos Islands, and established themselves there. So when we think about organisms colonizing islands, I want you to think about the dispersal capabilities of those organisms. And this is just an illustration of various dispersal capabilities, not really specific to islands. But if you think about a tree and how far a tree can disperse, how far it can spread its genes, okay? If you think about the dispersal of pollen, it could be carried by wind or insects, and that pollen can be carried from one tree to the other by insects, and that distance is probably not enormous. It's not tens or hundreds of miles. Insects simply don't carry the pollen that far. Now, once fertilized, the trees produce seeds, and those seeds might be enclosed in some kind of fruit that a bird will eat. Now, if it's a small fruit that's eaten by small birds that travel small distances, when those birds poop and poop out those seeds will be a small distance from the tree, as you can see illustrated by the bluebirds here that have eaten some seeds and pooped them out a short distance away. Now, if it's a larger fruit that's eaten by larger birds that travel larger distances, they may pass those fruits on even further distances. So different species of trees are going to have different dispersal capabilities depending on whether their pollen is carried by insects whether those insects travel short distances or long distances, and then also what form their seeds take. Is there anything that eats their seeds? If there is, how far will those organisms disperse the seeds? There are many tree species that exist today that used to be dispersed by long extinct organisms. So there are no species now that eat their fruits and their seeds and are able to disperse them. So they currently don't disperse very well at all. There are also species of trees on mainlands that you can imagine have seeds that do not get carried very far by any species. So perhaps they're eaten by rodents and dispersed by rodents, okay? Or a very small bird species. So none of those is going to carry in their stomach the seeds of that tree to an island and poop them out on an island. Whereas other tree species with long dispersal capabilities, they are more likely to colonize islands. So even with trees and plants, we have differential abilities to colonize islands. Some trees and plants you see on lots of islands, some you see on very few islands. And I want you to think about trees that you're going to see on the islands. And two of the trees that you're going to see quite commonly, mangroves and coconut trees or palm trees, they have seeds that are built for dispersal through the oceans, okay? Coconuts and mangrove seeds, which I'll show you if you've never seen one, float in the ocean. They can survive out to sea for ages and wash up on the beach and establish themselves there and grow. So that is why they're capable of establishing themselves on islands across the world. Now think about an acorn from an oak tree. That thing is going to sink right to the bottom of the ocean if it washes out to sea. It will not colonize an island. Okay? Consider these two birds. Which of these two bird species do you think is more likely to colonize a very distant island from the mainland? Okay? Certainly the hawk, which you're familiar with seeing soaring around with little effort, a larger species that has significant fat reserves it can go without eating for a significant period of time, is going to be able to disperse far to much further islands than would a small songbird. Here I'm showing you the position of the island of Anak Krakatau, and this island, this is the one I've talked about already, recently had this volcanic activity. Large explosions created a tsunami that hit Indonesia. What's interesting about this island, and this is touched on in your text, it was wiped clean not that long ago. So in the 1800s, this island was decimated, basically cleared of any living creature because of the massive volcanic eruptions that occurred. Okay, so that was in 1883. It's only 40 kilometers away, or about 20 miles, from both of these larger land masses. But what's interesting is things that are capable of dispersing well, like ferns that have these small spores, those ferns, 40% of the mainland species of fern have reached this island since 1883. Conversely, many of the rainforest trees that exist on these mainland areas, these larger mainland areas, many of the trees in these forests have failed to colonize this island since 1883 because they are simply not built for dispersal across the ocean. Your text also discusses the Azores, so islands just west of Spain and Portugal. And as you might expect, there are some things that you don't find on these islands. There's a certain disharmony. So unlike Portugal and Spain, which have birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, all sorts of species, when you get to the Azores, they're a big, nice landmass. The climate is quite similar to Portugal, but they lack entirely amphibians and land mammals. There are simply no species that have traveled or floated from Europe or Africa to these islands. And in fact, if you go back and look at the pattern of currents that are illustrated in your text, in the previous chapter, you'll see that currents would not take anything from Europe or Africa out to these islands. The currents don't run that direction. So this illustrates a couple of things. It illustrates the disharmony, and it illustrates the limits to dispersal capabilities of certain species. Those dispersal capabilities are described here. So basically, for each of these taxonomic groups, freshwater fishes, large mammals, small mammals, etc., it basically tells you the largest water gap that we know any of these organisms certainly crossed. So freshwater fishes, like a crappie or a bass, okay, a fish you might find in Sardis Lake, they are not going to swim across the ocean to reach an island. They cannot live in saltwater. Large mammals, on the other hand, they have a much better, greater capability of surviving being in saltwater for a period of time. Small mammals can get even further, okay? So something like a squirrel or a beaver or an otter, something like that, those things can travel much larger distances. And the largest distance here indicated is 410 kilometers. And that's the one we already talked about. Remember, lemurs reached, oh, actually, I think we're about to talk about that. Lemurs reached Madagascar from Africa, or at least their ancestors did. Rodents, land tortoises, and snakes have traveled very significant distances to reach these islands of the Galapagos. Now, it's a bit surprising that the distance for amphibians is so great that they can travel such a long distance when I've just talked to you about how amphibians aren't in the Azores, and that's largely due to currents. But frogs, salamanders, those types of organisms that you're probably familiar with, they have a permeable skin and they cannot tolerate exposure to salt water. They have colonized islands, though, over great water distances, and it's believed that that may have been because these things are so small, they could be in a large log that's floating out in the ocean. The eggs of an amphibian could make it from mainland to island on the feet of a bird that's walking around a pool that has sticky frog eggs in it. Who knows? If you look further down, gymnosperms, so plants, can make it great distances. Some species can, those that have seeds that are amenable to floating in the ocean for a long period of time. Lizards have made great distances, largely because they live in trees. Trees frequently, with big storms, wash out into the ocean, and lizards can handle that. They can go without food for a while, and they can tolerate salt water. And it should probably not surprise you that things like bats, birds, insects, those kinds of things, they can travel pretty great distances through the ocean. Okay, this is figure 3.2, and it illustrates a number of the mechanisms that organisms can use to disperse to islands naturally. And we will be using these terms, so it's important that you understand the difference between these. We'll start at the top, aerial or passive dispersers. So the first on the left is, it's kind of a boomerang-shaped seed pod that is meant to be blown around. Okay, so it's designed to move significant distances from the parent tree that drops it. In the middle there, looks something like a beetle, an insect that is capable of flight, doesn't necessarily fly like a dragonfly wherever it wants. It can fly, but it's going to get blown around pretty significantly. And then furthest to the right is a bit of a dandelion. So like you might have done as a child, you pick one up and you blow it and those things fly through the air pretty well. Imagine a big breeze or wind could certainly take that out across the sea to an island. All right. The next one below, aerial active. So these are things that can purposefully fly any direction they like and are quite capable of reaching islands. So bats, birds, things like butterflies and dragonflies. We will talk about a few butterfly examples because butterflies, there's a lot of diversity in butterflies. Some of them are very strong flyers and can go wherever the hell they want despite winds. There are other species that are very weak flyers and kind of bounce around and don't do directional that well. So there are some butterflies that are more aerial passive and some that are aerial active. Aquatic passive describes the method used by things like coconuts and lizards. You can see here a lizard floating on a log. They're basically along for the ride. Wherever the ocean currents take them, that's where they'll end up. And then aquatic active, things like a swimming lizard here illustrated that can reach an island because it's capable of swimming wherever it likes. Now, it's not going to swim from England to New York, but these organisms can swim great distances. Okay. There is also the illustration of the two birds that are on the island already, and it says animal internal, animal external. And I want you to realize that these describe the first one, animal internal. I've already talked to you about this. Birds might eat fruits on the mainland, fly to an island, poop out the seeds. So internally, they have carried with them a different species that has now colonized the island. Animal external describes the things like, let's say, the bird lice or the frog eggs attached to the feet of this seagull. So a bird might fly to the island on purpose and passively carry with it some other species. I love this figure 3.3 from your text because it illustrates a really interesting phenomena. Because when we talk about dispersal capabilities and dispersal limits, it's easy to think about, okay, birds can go anywhere, bats can go anywhere, tigers can't, tortoises can, right? It's easy to pigeonhole everything. But this figure and the enormously long figure legend beneath it, which I encourage you to read, illustrates that a group that we would consider highly dispersive, like birds, is comprised of some groups that can go pretty much anywhere and others that are not great at moving across the ocean to great distances to reach distant islands. So these lines, 1 through 7, mark the easternmost limit of the distribution of certain species of birds whose origins are concentrated in Australia and New Guinea. So a lot of these things, all of these things occur in Australia and New Guinea, that region. Some of them, like the bird of paradise, that red and blue bird to the left, some of them don't make it very far. They're not good at crossing the ocean. And so they occur only in New Guinea and the islands around there. They don't cross line number 1. There are some birds that don't cross 2, some that don't cross 3, some that don't cross 4. I've thrown a couple of the birds that are mentioned in there. So for example, bush turkeys do not cross line 5. They can make it that far, but given the amount of evolutionary time that they've had, they have not had any dispersal that's taken them further than line 5. Ducks don't make it past 6, barn owls don't make it past 7, and rails, one of the most remarkable radiations of birds in the Pacific, one of the most diverse groups of birds in the Pacific. They make it, they're one of the few birds that make it out to Pitcairn Island and Easter Island. I'll note that we're going to talk about rails a good bit later because part of the reason they're so diverse is that they disperse to islands and then they will frequently develop the inability to fly. So even though they might have an island very close nearby that they could fly and interbreed and maintain a single population, a single species, when they lose the ability to fly, they lose the ability to interbreed and they become distinct species on every one of these little tiny islands. Okay? So there's lots of rail diversity in the Pacific, and we'll talk more about that later. Okay, figure 3.4 illustrates the filter effect in probably not the most exciting way they possibly could. But what they're showing you here is the distribution of species, or the proportion of species on each of these islands, birds on top or reptiles below, that occur, let's start on the left, that are on Bali. So what proportion of the birds on Bali have sort of a Western or Oriental, so close, are they more similar to things on Java? Are they more similar to things to the east, like on Lombok or Sumbawa or Flores or all the way to Australia? You can see that on Bali, the vast majority, 95% of the birds have affinities with, have their origins in the Orient. And only about 5% of the species have Eastern, so Australian or New Guinean origins. The same is true of reptiles. And as we move from left to right, from Bali to Aru, you'll see that those black bars go down, okay? So a smaller and smaller proportion of these organisms have Oriental affinities, so Western affinities, and an increasing proportion have Eastern or Australian affinities. So this is that filter effect. The further away you get from the Orient, the further you move to the right or the East, the less influence the Orient has on the biodiversity. The closer you get to Australia, the greater the influence of Australian colonists. Okay? These similarities of islands to continental faunas bring us to the discussion of biogeographic realms. And this is something that is specific to the field of biogeography, and it certainly applies to island biogeography. As you might expect, places that are close to one another are generally very similar biologically. They have similar species. Now, if we look at this map, these are the described or known biogeographic realms. You'll see that, let's start on the left, the Americas. North America and South America are quite distinct. They have distinct faunas. And that shouldn't surprise you given what you learned about the geology of the region, that these two continents used to be separated, okay? And they've only recently been connected to one another. So the distinct South American things or the distinct North American things have only had a few million years to mix and mingle, and they haven't done that all that much, okay? So if you show me a bunch of birds that someone took a picture of and ask me whether they were in Missouri or Bolivia, I can tell you, because just by looking at the birds, I know that they are either characteristically South American or North American. The same is true of island faunas, and the islands are generally quite similar to a nearby landmass, continental landmass, that may be, or is frequently, a primary source of the species that inhabit those regions. Here we get to one of the most interesting island biogeographic patterns, one that was first described by Alfred Russel Wallace, the father of biogeography, and island biogeography in particular. He spent many years working in the islands of Southeast Asia, so between Thailand and Australia, visited damn near all of these islands, studied the biodiversity, collected specimens, and made some really interesting observations. And you'll note here that there are a couple lines drawn, Wallace's line, Weber's line, and Lydecker's line. Let's talk primarily about Wallace's line. It's the most famous and the first described. And it's an imaginary line drawn on a map that separates biologically an Asian fauna from an Australian fauna. Now, we already talked about some of these islands in figure 3.4 when we talked about the filter effect. But what Wallace observed is that when he was on the island of Bali, he saw very characteristically Asian things like rhinoceros, tigers, very Asian bird species. And when he made this very short trip from Bali to Lombok, he found completely different species there. He no longer found those Asian species. What he found were primarily Australian species like tree kangaroos and cockatoos, a type of parrot. And that caused him to define this biogeographic line that separated the Asian realm from the Australian realm. What's interesting is, and he didn't know at the time, if we look at the continental shelf beneath the ocean around these regions, you'll see it makes sense why Java and Bali and Borneo have characteristically Asian species. It's because they're all on the same continental shelf. They're continental shelf islands. So if the water were to drop just a bit, the sea level were to drop, they would all be connected in one landmass. tigers and rhinos could walk around freely from Borneo to Java, from Java to Bali. But the ocean between Bali and Lombok is incredibly deep. It will never, the sea level will never drop so much that those two islands are connected. It's thousands of feet deep, okay? And that explains this biogeographic pattern, okay? This really gets to the importance of the history of climatic fluctuation in the past, the fluctuation of sea levels, and how those have shaped the biodiversity that we see on islands today. Okay, so we've touched on the regionalism, biogeographic regionalism bit of this section, and now we're on to the vicariance versus dispersal debate again. And remember, I told you this was quite a contentious issue. I'm just going to revisit this. You should be pretty comfortable with this concept by now. Remember, vicariance, organisms lived all over the place, and then the viable habitat was fragmented, and they inhabited, after that, all of those fragments. And if they're not interbreeding between fragments, then they become different over time. Dispersal, on the other hand, you have individuals in one area that will colonize, one way or another, other habitat patches and differentiate themselves after colonization and become different species. So why do we have all the species on these islands that we have them on? Well, it's either vicariance or dispersal, and biologists have fun testing these hypotheses, including myself. So here's a great example of vicariance versus dispersal debate. So Madagascar, if you'll remember some of this, we've already talked about the geology of the fragmentation of the southern continents. All used to be one, okay? And Madagascar was jammed right in the middle there, okay? South America and Africa used to fit together, and they still look like they would fit together, two little puzzle pieces that would go together. And we still see the remnants of this history today. And if you look at fossils, there's even more clear patterns. So things like camels and rhinos used to live in South America. Today you find those only in Africa, okay? But they used to occur in both when they were connected. All right, let's focus on Madagascar. So Madagascar was, until about 160 some odd million years ago, connected both to Africa and India. About 160 some odd million years ago, India and Madagascar together broke away. So Madagascar hasn't been touching Africa for at least 150 million years, okay? And at about 88 million years ago, India broke off. So Madagascar's been alone for 88 million years, okay? So let's think about some really characteristic species that we see on this island of Madagascar. We see these elephant birds, these gigantic bird species that are very similar, closely related to ostriches, and we see lemurs, which are closest relatives. Lemurs are found only in Madagascar, but their closest relatives are found on mainland Africa. Now, if we think about why are these creatures on Madagascar? Did they disperse there, or were they there before Madagascar separated from Africa? Is it because of vicariance? If we look at the elephant bird, we can use various data, fossil data, molecular data, so DNA sequence data, to infer, and we have inferred, that these elephant birds, their most recent common ancestor with ostriches is about 135 or more million years ago, okay? So they've been on their own in Madagascar for 135 million years, okay? So what that means is they've been around long enough that they could have predated this separation of Madagascar and India, and their origin, their differentiation from ostriches could be because of that split 135 million years ago. Lemurs, on the other hand, they differentiated from their African kin about 35 million years ago. And if you look here, you can see Madagascar's been alone for almost 90 million years. So the only explanation for these primates being on the island of Madagascar is that they dispersed from Africa to the island of Madagascar. Okay? So here we have an instance of vicariance in the ratite, the large bird, and an instance of dispersal by lemurs across the ocean from Africa to Madagascar. The next topic that's touched on in your text is really an interesting one, and it's an important distinction when we think about the endemics that we find on islands. When we go to an island and find a species that's only on that island, there are a couple explanations for why that is the only place it is found. They could be neo-endemics, or they might be paleo-endemics. So let's first consider an example of a neo-endemic. Here we have a couple species 1, 2, and 3, these interesting kingfishers that live on the islands around New Guinea. So if you see what the mainland species look like, they're all quite similar to these smaller island species 1, 2, and 3. How did we get those 3 species on those little islands off of the main New Guinea island? Okay. Well, what we know to be true is that those smaller islands were colonized through dispersal by individuals from the mainland. But they don't fly back and forth to the mainland all that often, and so because they're breeding amongst themselves only, they've changed over time and become 3 different species. All right? So these are new endemics. They are new to the world because of their existence on that island and only on that island. That's a neo-endemic. Here we have an example of a paleo-endemic. This species of what looks to be a lizard, very similar to the iguanas we will see on Grand Cayman, is actually a very distinct species. It's the last surviving member of its group. It's very unique. It's no more a lizard than is a crocodile or a snake or a turtle. It is a very unique reptile that is found only on the islands of New Zealand. So the red circle in the map at the top. So this species is endemic to New Zealand. But why is it endemic to New Zealand? If you look at the map, all of those gray and white and black dots indicate where fossils of this group can be found. And you'll see that there are fossils throughout the Americas, Africa, Europe, Asia, India. These things used to be everywhere. And it's an ancient lineage that's been around for hundreds of millions of years. They predate the dinosaurs, and they have gone extinct everywhere except this island, okay? And it's for that reason that we call these paleo-endemics. So paleo, you've probably heard used paleontology. It's a prefix that means we can just use to mean old. And in this case, these paleo-endemics are endemic to this island because they've been around for so long, they've simply gone extinct everywhere else. After reading this section on Macaronesia, which is a region that the authors favor, it's an island group off the coast of Africa that includes the Azores, you get to a section on endemism. We just touched on neo and paleo, but I want to talk to you a bit about the endemic animals and plants. So the chapter ends primarily going through some really interesting numbers for endemic birds, lizards, mammals, insects, snails, plants. And these numbers are fascinating to me, and I hope they are fascinating to you. There's some really interesting patterns. The number of endemics that are found on islands, the proportion of endemics that are found on islands is quite remarkable. So snails are one of the most remarkably diverse and densely endemic on islands. We are going to see a number of endemics on these islands. So this parrot is a Cayman parrot species endemic to the Cayman Islands. We should see those on our first island visit, or our second island, sorry. Snails are things that we don't often see. I'll point them out when we find them, but they are quite diverse on islands. The bottom left is that's a Caribbean island iguana. We are going to see the Cayman endemic iguana species. We'll see quite a few of them. They're a remarkable species and they're well protected on Grand Cayman. We won't see any on Jamaica. They were thought to be extinct for decades. They were recently rediscovered. You can see them at zoos in the US. The Fort Worth Zoo heads a breeding program for the Jamaican iguana, but in the wild there are probably less than a few dozen that still survive. Top right, insects. Lots of endemic insects on islands. I've put a lightning bug up here because there's a species of lightning bug that used to be endemic to the Cayman Islands, but it appears to be extinct, believed to be the result of spraying for mosquitoes. So it's a small island. You want to keep mosquitoes away from the people that live there, you spray the whole island and you kill all the mosquitoes and, unfortunately, the endemic lightning bug. Plants, lots of endemic plants on islands. This crazy looking rodent with the elephant snout is a Selenodon. It's a group that's endemic to the Greater Antilles. Really remarkable, ancient, primitive lineage of mammal found only on islands. This is certainly a paleo-endemic. Used to probably be on the mainlands of Central America, maybe North America, but today found only on these islands of the Antilles. Cryptic endemics. So what does cryptic mean? Cryptic means hard to find, hard to see, unrecognized, along those lines. This section of the text touches on cryptic endemics, and it highlights an issue that biologists have been tackling largely using DNA sequence data in the past few decades. So when we go to two different islands and we see what looks to be the same species, we might be tempted to call them the same thing. But with DNA data, we are able to examine them and determine, holy smokes, they are very different genetically. They are not interbreeding with one another. They are indeed distinct species. Now, the species illustrated here is not one that was discovered because of that. It was simply a species that is on a small remote island that people had not visited and looked for lizards in particular. So once visited, this large species of lizard was found to be on this island and is indeed an endemic. So this is a large species of lizard that was described only in 2000. So since you were born, okay, there are new species described every day, and many of them are cryptic species that were never found, never seen, or never recognized as distinct species. The last thing I want to touch on this section on biodiversity as we think about diversity on islands is extinct endemics. So what you see here is a small species of elephant that used to live on this small island off the coast of Greece. So you see it's kind of a pinkish shaded island in this map in the top left in the middle of the Mediterranean. These small species of elephants were found only on that island, and this is a pattern dwarfism that we see often on islands. But these things used to be there. We know that they were there because of the fossils. But it's an important thing to realize that when we are studying the biodiversity of islands, we go and visit the islands and we see what's there and find these remarkable species and quantify the diversity and exclaim how remarkably diverse and unique these island faunas are. It's important that you remember that there used to be other things there. And in many cases, there used to be lots of other things. And they may have been very important for the ecosystem. Imagine the change on a smallish island like this when this large herbivorous species, so it eats plants, this large elephant species, I mean it's not large for an elephant, but it's pretty large for an island mammal, disappeared from that island. That would have completely shifted the biology of that island. The habitats would have changed dramatically. And so when we study islands, we can't study them as if they've always been the way they are right now as we experience them. We have to look for clues of previous inhabitants and recognize that any conclusions we come to are necessarily incomplete because we don't have complete knowledge of the history of the diversity on that island.